Welcome to Influential Entrepreneurs, bringing you interviews with elite business leaders and experts, sharing tips and strategies for elevating your business to the next level. Here's your host, Mike Saunders.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Influential Entrepreneurs. This is Mike Saunders, the Authority Positioning Coach. Today we're privileged to have with us Sean O'Mara, who is the co-author of The Apology Impulse, How the Business World Ruined Sorry and Why We Can't Stop Saying It. Sean, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Mike. Good to speak to you.
Hey, this is a really interesting topic. I think it's really curious because you don't hear much about it. You normally hear, leadership qualities of the top leaders in the world and how you can be one too, or things like that. But typically apology, those are some tough topics to address. So I want to talk about the book and your approach to business using the apology impulse, but catch us up to speed and give us a little bit of your background and what led you to this business that you're in.
Okay, so I'm a publicist by trade. So my day job really is to look after the reputations of my clients, help them become more well-known, attract customers, keep customers, crucially. And the way I put it is I like to make people a little bit more famous. So We do that in a number of ways. A lot of it is through research. We do some consumer advocacy to position the client where they want to be in their particular market. And a small element, although it is an increasing element of what we do, is kind of repairing and addressing failure. And that's what led me to being interested in the concept of corporate and public apologies.
Yeah, and I would suspect that one element of this is don't just sweep it under the carpet and whatever the issue is, don't just assume it's going to go away on its own. So how do you teach your clients or organizations you work with how to recognize when an apology is needed and what to do about it?
It's actually more complicated than I ever thought it would be. So the biggest challenge I have with clients is stopping them from saying sorry, because with social media and with the access that gives to organizations, a client may be tempted, and it happens a lot more than people might realize, to apologize to just make criticism go away.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons I was inspired to explore this as a book was because I was guilty of that. I used to take that approach of let's say sorry and then let's look at the problem. And I had a great client for a number of years who was in the logistics industry. So he had a company with a lot of moving parts. And one of the challenges he had was getting his own customers to be responsible for the parts of the service that he couldn't control. And the main problem there was sort of import papers and customs documents. So he could do everything pretty much except for physically signing the customs documentation. And that presented a challenge for him because he would have clients neglect that part of their responsibility. Their goods would be held up in customs on the other side of the world, so either their customer wouldn't receive it or, they were sending it to family or themselves. And then they would automatically think, oh, well, the logistics company has failed here. So he had a situation a few years ago where there was a customer that had raised an issue internally, and he'd explained what was going on, and he said, well, we're going to try and help you, but this is why we strongly encourage customers to read this part of the agreement and take care of the customs documentation. So long story short, this guy wasn't satisfied with that explanation, so he thought he would shame the client on social media, which is a fairly common thing. And I was kind of panicking on his behalf, saying, okay, well, we'll apologize, and then we'll look at what went wrong. And he said, I'm not apologizing. And it was the first time I'd ever heard a business leader or business owner refuse to apologize.
Yeah.
So we talked about it, and I had to admit that he was right. He hadn't done anything wrong, and he was keen to protect his reputation. So he was firm and fair. He said, we are trying to help. Here's what we think you should do. We've spoken to customs authorities at the destination, but our hands are tied to a degree. And eventually this customer just accepted that it was his own fault, and he didn't really, his criticism wasn't especially fair. Now, what I learned from that is if you haven't done anything wrong and you say sorry, you then devalue the word sorry, because if somebody only says sorry when they're criticized, how do you know when they actually mean it? So, and organizations do this a lot, and it's one of the big problems with corporate communications, especially when you're doing it via social media, that sorry, I mean, the title of the book, The Apology Impulse, it's impulsive and reflexive, and the more organizations do it, the less consumers trust them. There's been plenty of studies that show this, but as far as the organizations are concerned, they only seem to have one way of handling criticism, and that is to say sorry and then cross their fingers, hope the criticism goes away. So it's almost a cultural issue as well as a business issue.
It's almost a knee-jerk reaction or a fallback, or it's just what people are conditioned to do. They think that saying that or just approaching that is checking off the box. Done. Let's move on.
Yeah.
And as you're explaining that, it made me think of something that I think really is a deep concept. So, what do you think of this? Have you ever heard of the phrase that we hear so many times, "The customer is always right"?
Yeah, I have, and and
that's not the case, right? Because your example you gave, the customer was not right. So how do you balance that with your agency's focus of helping people looking like an authority, an expert, a trusted advisor, having a great reputation? Because if you took that example that you were mentioning and that person just said, "I am so sorry, let me tell you why I'm sorry, let me tell you how I'm apologizing," now doesn't that take them down a notch or two, and they're not seen as maybe a knowledgeable, trusted advisor or an expert, but they need to take the approach of being loving and caring, of course, but just gently describing the situation and explaining any situation that we're talking about, but explaining where they are and where the path forward is. And then that customer should be ended up with the thought of, that's a good point. I kind of was a little bit off base, but thanks for bringing that to my attention.
Yeah, it's a good point. And going back to the customer is always right. Obviously, I don't think that is true. I mean, it's true a lot, but it's not a hard and fast rule. So the customer isn't always right, and the critic isn't always a customer. And that's something that organizations need to understand. So one of the problems we've identified through doing the research for the book is organizations often apologize to what we would describe as their audience. And audience and customer isn't the same. I follow Ferrari on Twitter, for example. I am not a customer of Ferrari. I probably never will be.
Yeah, right.
And, there's lots of, brands are public property. And when brands commit to social media, they commit to apologizing because they are going to do things that not everybody is going to like. So the interesting dichotomy that is at play that results in all of these low-value apologies kind of floating around is before social media, an organization would only apologize if they had infringed your rights. So you're an airline, it's snowing, you're gonna have to cancel some flights. So you're going to say sorry to your customers, and it could be any business, but that's an issue of consumer rights. Now, that consumers have such direct, unfiltered access to brands online, usually via Twitter, also Facebook, these organizations are responsible for the consumer's feelings. So they might do an advert that some consumers find in bad taste. That, Pepsi were a great example of this, where they used, I think it was Kendall Jenner, in an advert that it looked like a Pepsi-sponsored civil rights march. And Pepsi put the advert out. People got mad with Pepsi. So Pepsi apologized, and then they withdrew the advert. And that was all within the space of 24 hours. And none of that was to do with the product. Pepsi tasted the same the day before and the day after that advert. It was the same price. It came in the same can. It was a matter of Pepsi's stated values that had upset people. So Pepsi said sorry, and it did nothing really to repair the damage. They inflicted the damage on themselves by kind of trying to portray themselves as a value-driven organization. Now, you do get value-driven organizations. Patagonia are a good example of this, Ben & Jerry's. In the UK, we've got Marks and Spencer's, which is a retailer who it's one of the best perceived retailers in the UK. It looks after its staff. It's got an ethical supply chain, and the prices are pretty good for what is effectively a premium product. They do food, retail, and clothes, and home and insurance. They do a lot of things. They're a trusted brand, and one of the reasons they're trusted is because they back up their values with action. And Patagonia back up their values with action. They've got a whole kind of history of doing socially good things. Now, the problem we've got is that other organizations, other brands have seen the benefit of this. And there was actually a study published in around 2012 called Grow, which in a nutshell told brands that social purpose and culture and values are not only nice to have, they are inextricably linked to your capacity to grow and make a profit. And they cited examples like Apple and said, if you want to grow and be successful, you need to tell customers what you stand for and what you don't stand for. But it was a controversial study for a number of reasons, but one of the big controversies was the methodology and the kind of correlation-causation problem where, yes, Apple have, a set of social values, and they happen to be an enormous company, but they aren't necessarily enormous because of those values. They just happen to have them. So what we got was a lot of brands reversing into that and using corporate social responsibility as a marketing trick. And then, so they made all these grand promises. They told consumers, we care about the climate, we care about equality, we care about body positivity. They were all picking a cause. And consumers believed them and said, okay, great. And then the brands would fall short because, lo and behold, they were organizations that wanted to make a profit, so they had to sell products. And consumers got a little bit miffed and said, hey, I thought you cared about these things that I care about. You told me that in your last advert. So the only way out of that kind of corner for the brands is to grovel. And then they humiliate themselves in public by doing it. And the book actually catalogues, some of the most hard to read apologies, and not hard to read because of what they're saying, but hard to read because of how they're saying it, and how humiliated these organizations have become.
I think that it's such an onion that you keep peeling back layers and layers and layers, and you think, yeah, I've got that piece, and then it uncovers even more opportunity to fine-tune on this concept. So I'd like to dial it in and ask you a question. What are you seeing in working with clients and writing your book? What do you think are the worst habits that people make? And keeping this in mind, Sometimes a habit is not doing something. But what is a habit that people make regarding apologizing, whether it's an action habit or an inaction habit?
Oh, there's a few. The one that really kind of personally annoys me, and whenever I describe this to somebody, I tell them, you once you see this, you can never unsee it. So when an organization apologizes, there's a tendency to lead into the apology with a character reference. So let's say you get an email from your bank, and the first line of that email is, "We take the protection of your data very seriously." You know there's a but coming. You know that they're about to tell you that they've been hacked and you need to change your password. And it's almost reflexive for organizations to do that. They can't seem to stop themselves speaking to their own virtues. So that kind of, in the book we called it Schrodinger's apology. It's we did nothing wrong and here's how we're going to fix it. It's the organization kind of balancing their guilt with their previous good conduct by saying, we care about this, and on this occasion we fell short. And that infuriates me and infuriates other customers because you don't want to hear it. It may be true. You know, these brands may care about this thing that they're about to apologize for, but that's not what the apology is there to do.
What about the opposite, where you actually issue a correctly worded apology, and then it's almost like you can visualize in your mind ... But what we really intended was the fact, and then you start to, literally in the same breath, you start to justify that, and then it comes off as not an apology.
Yeah, the corporate non-apology. Any kind of qualification has no place in an apology. So the simple rule that I tell a client, if they have to email a customer or put something on social media, if they're using the word but, they need to rewrite their apology, because an apology shouldn't contain the word but. If is a good one as well. You get a lot of we apologize if you were inconvenienced, or we apologize for any and you need to own the fact that the customer is inconvenienced, or, you know, worse, because that is the natural consequence of your failure as an organization.
What if this happened? What if you were thinking, well, if you were inconvenienced then, and that's the brand thinking, well, there might have been an issue, but I'm not really going to make a big deal of it. But what if that brand said, we profusely apologize for this catastrophic issue of, and I'm not saying to do this in public, but what if it was a one-to-one or a small communication message, and they really took ownership and blew it up to be this really big thing? Would that not give the opening for that the consumers to go, oh, thank you so much, but, you know, it really wasn't that big of a deal? And so it's almost like when you start saying, look at how little it is, then the natural reaction is to say, no, it was huge. But when you say, look how horrible this was, then the natural reaction is, well, it really wasn't all that bad.
Yeah, you're right. And organizations do often over-apologize. There's actually, in How to Win Friends and Influence People, Dale Carnegie talks about something very similar to what you've just described, where he says he bought a set of curtains, an expensive set of curtains. The first visitor to his house, he said, do you like my new curtains? And they said, yeah, they're lovely. And then he told them what he spent. And his friend said, well, you've been ripped off. Dale's instinct was to say, no, I haven't. You know, you don't understand. These are really expensive and it's a rare fabric. The next visitor, when Dale told them what they cost, said, oh, I wish I could afford a lovely pair of curtains like that. And then Dale, the author of the book, comes out and says, well, actually, I think I might have overpaid. So when the kind of the other person in the scenario concedes ground, it is a natural instinct to kind of meet them halfway. But there is a problem as well with over-apologizing, and that is that contrition exists on a spectrum. So if I'm late, if I'm meeting you for coffee and I'm 10 minutes late, I'm going to turn up, I'm going to go, oh, hey, Mike, sorry I'm late. Traffic was heavy. How are you? And that's kind of it. If I borrow your car and I write it off, it's a different kind of apology. So when you over-apologize, and Airbnb was probably the textbook example of over-apologizing. So back in the early days of Airbnb, they had a customer she'd rented out her home, and the people that rented it from her had a party. They trashed it, thousands of dollars worth of damage. Airbnb put out a hysterical statement. They called it a tragedy. They said they were paralyzed when they found out. Now, that's over the top. But then about 3 years later, an Airbnb customer was murdered by her host. And Airbnb's statement on that was kind of mild in comparison. So you actually run out of rhetorical headroom. So you need to leave a bit of space linguistically for the really bad stuff. Because if you go kind of sackcloth, ashes, a dozen roses when you're apologizing for a kind of modest, moderate failure, and we all fail, organizations fail. So customers anticipate and expect it. They actually build it into their expectations. If you go in too hard with the contrition, then the person that really deserves the kind of blockbuster apology is going to be devalued when they get it. You've already worn out sorry by the time you have to apologize for something huge.
I think we could probably take a deep breath and go into phase 2 of our interview and be just 2 hours in and still be scratching the surface. So let's wrap up with this powerful mindset of how to approach apologies while still maintaining your credibility. That's kind of what I'm feeling out of this. And just say, what's the best way people can reach out to you, engage with your brand, pick up a copy of the book? What's the best way that they can do that?
Okay, so I'm on Twitter. My handle is Sean O'Mara, or all one word, SeanOM for mother, EARA. My business website is essentialcontent.co.uk, and the book is available in, I want to use the cliche, all good bookshops. You can get it in Barnes & Noble. It's on Amazon. And you can buy it direct from our publishers, who are Kogan Page, who are a fantastic publishing company. So it's available kind of anywhere you would expect it to be available. And as much as the book is about here's what organizations have done badly when they've been criticized, it's also about what they can do better. And that's kind of really simple. It's a case of decide if you're sorry, decide how sorry you are, keep it brief, use plain language, don't waffle, don't use the passive voice, don't talk about yourself. And the most important thing, and this is the bit that's usually missing, is what happens next. What are you going to do to stop the mistake that you just made happening again? And that's what customers care about.
Yep. Well, what happens next should be pick up a copy of your book. And Sean, thank you so much for coming on today. It was really a pleasure to talk with you.
Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to Influential Entrepreneurs with Mike Saunders. To learn more about the resources mentioned on today's show or listen to past episodes, visit www.influentialentrepreneursradio.com.